Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're back for more testing on the 7.3 PTR, and today we're looking at Varimathras in Antorus, the Burning Throne.
This is likely the 8th boss in the instance, and sadly it's a patchwork style fight. The encounter hasn't got many mechanics, and most of the fight is stick together, move as a group between 2 points, whilst just simply nuking the boss.
Now before going into anything, just a quick reminder that this footage is from the PTR, so things are subject to change. We will have our full up-to-date live guide for this encounter once the boss reaches live servers. Right, let's kick straight into it and talk about this boss.
So primarily the fight is all about just not taking shadow damage, as anytime you take any shadow damage you'll receive a 7-second debuff called Misery. This prevents you from receiving any direct healing and also increases the physical damage you take by 200%. Not receiving any healing sucks at the best of time, but it's especially bad during this fight as the raid is constantly taking ticking damage from the very beginning all the way to the very end. To start off with, it just begins as fire damage, but it changes as the fight goes on. 2 minutes after pulling the boss, it will switch to frost and will now begin to slow everyone as well. 2 minutes later, it will then turn back to fire, but the damage will now start to ramp up. And if you manage to survive the 2 minutes of ramping up damage, it will now turn into shadow, making everyone instantly immune to all healing effects and will simply wipe you. So this puts a strict and rage on the encounter, as you need to kill the boss before you all become immune to healing. With this in mind, let's have a look at the other abilities and how best to avoid gaining Misery.
Now whenever anyone isn't within 8 yards of somebody else, the boss will cast Alone in the Darkness on them. This will just deal a burst of shadow damage to that player, which of course applies Misery. So throughout the entire fight you want the entire raid to be stacked, aside from the tanks who need to be stood next to one another. That being said, the tanks cannot both stand in front of the boss because of his Shadow Strike. Each time the boss reaches 100 energy, he'll do a cleave in front of him, dealing a large amount of shadow damage. So you only want one tank to take this damage from the boss, because otherwise both of them will gain Misery and just die super quick. But the off tank needs to be within 8 yards of the other tank to avoid Alone in the Darkness from hitting either of them. To fix this, you want the main tank to be as close to the middle of the boss's hitbox as possible, without flipping him towards the raid, whilst the other tank is as close to the boss as possible, but whilst remaining on the opposite side of the hitbox to avoid getting hit by the cleave. So basically, one tank is sniffing the boss's crotch, while the other one is sniffing the boss's ass. Nice. Either way, after the hit goes off, the off tank needs to taunt and the tanks switch positions, whilst always standing within 8 yards of one another. And that's all the tanks do throughout the fight, so let's have a look at the rest of the raid.
On a timer, 3 dark fissures will spawn underneath the location of random players, one after another. These deal shadow damage every 3 seconds for 6 seconds, and after this they explode, dealing a large burst of shadow damage to anyone within them. Now as these spawn, they do have a couple of seconds delay before they do their first tick, but it's nowhere near as long as what you see on the screen right now. This is from a heroic testing, and since then they have actually changed all the tooltips, and it does appear that they're going to tick way faster. So we recommend when you do this in the first week, as soon as the first fissure spawns, just to immediately move as a group, from one side of the boss to the other. When the boss is doing ticking frost damage to the raid, you may want to use a movement speed increase when moving from one side to the other, just to prevent any players from getting caught out. Also to deal with on a completely separate timer that actually never overlaps with Dark Fissure is Marked Prey. This marks a random non-tank player, and after 5 seconds the boss will send out a shadow version of himself in the direction of that player. Now this acts as a projectile, so it can be absorbed by having a player stand in front of the player. As soon as that player is hit, they take a burst of shadow damage and get knocked back. We decided to have a mobile melee DPS such as Rogue to take the hit because they can simply just shadow step back to the boss. This prevents the need to make a line of players for the knockback player to be hit through, as otherwise they could be knocked more than 8 yards away and get hit by Alone in the Darkness, which obviously isn't good. And the final ability, which is the most important by far to deal with in this encounter, is Necrotic Embrace. This is a debuff that lasts 6 seconds and is applied to a random non-tank player. When it expires, it deals a burst of shadow damage, and at the same time, the debuff will then attempt to jump to anyone within 10 yards. This will spread like a plague, coating the entire raid with a debuff, and then of course, because it deals shadow damage, also applying Misery, which will wipe you within a matter of seconds. So the player with a debuff needs to move out of the group, let the debuff expire, and then return. However, because the debuff will try and jump to any player within 10 yards, this player needs to be topped up by the healers before leaving the group, as they will get hit by both the Alone in the Darkness and Necrotic Embrace damage. And you won't be able to heal them for 7 seconds afterwards, because of Misery. And on top of that, the ticking damage, and you're going to have a bad time if they weren't topped off beforehand. Funnily enough though, if you do muck up and the player isn't topped and they are about to die, you can still give them health. You can use Spirit Link to save any players, but also Misery only affects the incoming healing, not absorb. So Disc Priest can also save players as well. But aside from the necrotic embrace, the marked prey, the fissures, and of course making sure that you're always within 8 yards of each other and the tank cleave, there's nothing else going on in this encounter. So, feedback, what do we think?
I'm not the biggest fan of patchwork, but just style fights. I think that's like pretty obvious. Every time we talk about one of these bosses, I'm pretty harsh about it. But yeah, this one is no different. It feels super repetitive. You stack up on one side of the boss, move to the other when the pulls form, have the rogue take the hit, or I don't know, demon hunter, anyone who can get back to the boss quickly, get them to take the hit, and then that's kind of it. You move out of the debuff as well, otherwise you're going to kill everyone. Although that's not even present on normal mode apparently, according to the dungeon journal. So yeah, it's kind of strange. We thought there was going to be a little bit more to it when we was testing it on PTR. That's why you can see we're kind of going in this weird little triangle formation. We thought maybe range need to be further out so the marked player could be knocked into them, but then we realized the shadow step works. So you can just do the 2 location strategy and just like oscillate between them. But yeah. It's just weird, man. I'm not a particular fan at all. Like, the whole idea of, like, the tanks need to be standing within 8 yards of each other, but one in front and one behind is, like, super fiddly. It's not a necessarily fun mechanic, and when you're doing it, not only does it look stupid, like, it looks super silly. It kind of feels unintentional.
What they should really do is just make it so tanks are immune to Alone in the Darkness. Make it so they cannot be hit by it.
Well, maybe they're trying to make it so the tanks are supposed to be hit by Alone in the Darkness and the cleave at the same time.
Maybe.
But the moment you can just, stand in this really weird particular position and you can kind of counter it, which, I don't know, it just seems like a fiddly mechanic that doesn't really add much to the fight apart from just making awkward movements.
Yeah.
Because, moving bosses at the best of times is annoying, let alone when you're right inside the hitbox. Because then he might, backpedal back a little bit or just quickly flip around and then, oh, right, you just wiped everyone.
To be honest, I think the tanks have the hardest job.
Yeah, it's so...
Which is just getting perfect positioning every single time while maintaining good tank swaps.
Exactly. The only redeeming factor for me in this fight is simply the necrotic embrace debuff. It is super funny when somebody accidentally doesn't move out in time.
Yeah.
Like, as the raid is all tranquil and, like, content, like, okay, we're killing the boss, it's fine. And then it just goes instantly to chaos. Because everyone's like, oh, I've got to move 10 yards away, and, like, the boss is shadow stepping everywhere with, the Alone in the Darkness, animation. It's absolutely hilarious. So yeah, that is one very good part of the fight.
I just think it's funny how the fight is all about minimizing misery debuffs when all this fight does is just make me miserable.
Aww. Oh,
but thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this little boss preview, then do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. And a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are awesome. Thank you very much for your continued support, and we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.